The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
Good evening, everyone. It really is my privilege to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces. Thank you very much, ETHOS, for this privilege of sharing a few thoughts. I must say that the heavy weight for tonight is really Professor Tan. I'm just here to add a few more perspectives. I want to say that even though I'm trained as a lawyer, tonight I'm here as a pastor. And I would like to give perhaps a more church or pastoral view to this very interesting topic of a conflict of liberties between civil and religious. And so we imagine a post-377A era where indeed there may be things that will be developing along the way that will compel us to ask what happens to our religious liberties, right? Will they be curtailed? How then do we respond as a church and as a Christian community? And so without really talking about what we're going to talk about tonight, actually Professor Tan and I, some of the areas do overlap. And so that shows really the commonality in terms of our thoughts, and I believe it's divinely inspired as well. So let me begin by sharing what Prof Tan has already mentioned. That indeed Article 15 of the Constitution, it's really clear. There is religious liberty. We have the liberty to profess, practice, and propagate. So 3 P's, right? Like a 3-point Methodist sermon, right? Practice, propagate, and profess your religion. However, it's subject to law relating to public order and morality and public health, and that the courts have defined that quite widely. And so we do have the liberty, but it's subject to limitations. But that's the first thing you and I need to know. And so tonight, I want to share 4 thoughts with you, just 4. And on this whole issue about the repeal of 377A, I think we need to do perhaps 4 things. And they're built on one another. So let me begin by sharing. The first thought I want to leave with you, that the issue at hand is equality versus liberty. So on one hand, we want to build equality amongst people of different preferences, sexual orientation. On the other hand, there is that issue of our liberty to practice what we personally strongly convicted about. So there's a clash there. That's the fundamental issue that we're looking at. So the first thought I leave with you is that you and I think, are called to anticipate a pressurizing trend. Yes, I believe that a year has passed, we have not seen much in terms of differences, but I do actually think down the road, if we watch how things do play out in the European countries, after their equivalent of Section 377A was removed years ago, I think this is what we will probably anticipate on the issue of LGBT civil rights, Q civil rights. We will see, perhaps in time to come, same-sex union and marriage. I think that's a reality we cannot run away from. And if you ask a young person today, and in my ministry I come across a lot of young adults, a lot of young people, this is not far from their thinking. This is not far from what they eventually envisage society to be. And this is not an issue of morality for them, my friends. It's an issue of fairness. And that's really important to understand. For a young person, being LGBTQ and being denied the right to a union or marriage is unfair. It's not immoral. We view it from a position of morality, but for them, it's a question of fairness. And therefore, in their point of view, not standing out, they would tend to support the underdog. And in supporting the underdog, this is going to be a development that will happen. And you would be down the road. I don't know how long it will be, but if it's going to be by Parliament's pleasure or Parliament's will and the majority, you can think that you will sway towards the view of a same-sex union and marriage. So that's a reality. The first trend In fact, if I may refer to the US Supreme Court case of Obadrit Fell versus Hodges in 2015, now this case is quite a landmark case. It recognizes a constitutionally protected right to same-sex marriage. It recognizes that. And it makes same-sex marriage recognizable across the United States. Which means if you are same-sex married, now it's a constitutional right to be recognized across the states. What's the difference between a civil union and a same-sex marriage? In the states, civil unions are recognized within the state. But now with this case, if you are married, same-sex marriage is recognized across states. Such is that protected right. So that's the first trend I want to leave with you, the same-sex unions and marriage. The second is that there will be more laws that will promote anti-discrimination. And so in Singapore, Article 12, equality of the law, it prohibits discrimination. And those of you following the news, you will know the government has announced the workplace fairness legislation. That should come out in the second half of 2024. And this workplace fairness legislation will ensure no discrimination on basis of your pregnancy status, right? No discrimination on basis of sex and marital status, on race and religion, but it doesn't cover sexual identity. And LGBTQ rights groups are already saying this piece of legislation ain't very fair. They are asking for more. They're asking that it should include perhaps explicitly stated category of sexual identity or sexual preference. So this is something that we need to watch the space. But in the United States of America, the Equality Act passed in 2021, very recent, during COVID, just 3 years ago. Now, this Equality Act prohibits discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in public accommodation and facilities, in education, in federal funding, in employment, in housing, in credit, even in the jury system. It's all spelled out very clearly. And this bill expands the definition of public accommodation to include places or establishments that provide exhibitions, recreation, exercise, amusement, gatherings. So you can tell it's a very extensive act that really spells out anti-discrimination. This is happening in the States. And perhaps in no time, we may be compelled to go that way. The third area is the rise of religious exemption cases. What happens is that in time to come, we may have more religious business owners, Christian business owners, for example, having to choose between adhering to their religious beliefs, their right to profess their beliefs, and versus serving same-sex couples or LGBTQ couples. In some countries, what business owners have sought is to ask for religious exemption. They've asked to be exempted, right, from providing services to LGBTQ couples. And this is going to be a reality, I think, that may hit us in a matter of time. And because same-sex marriage is legal in those countries, there has been a spate of what we call wedding vendor cases, where business owners providing goods and services in connection to same-sex marriage, they think they don't want to provide such service. They want to deny such services, and they have written for religious exemption, and it's turned out into court cases. So that's a reality that we may face in time to come. And states have applied what we call a competing interest test. Now, this test, if I may explain it very simply, it means this. It's a two-pronged test. Number one, whether the anti-discrimination law as applied will further a compelling government interest. So, for example, a government interest may be ensure equality to all, economic viability to all, so that all have access to services. So, does it further the compelling government interest? And whether denying the request is the least restrictive way of furthering this interest. So does it make sense to restrict this application of the test? So as you can tell, the rise of religious exemption cases is going to be a reality. So all I'm saying is the first thing, I think we all need to anticipate the trend. And that means that we can't wait for it to happen. In some sense, I do think it's compelling for us as the church to begin to think more deeply about the implications down the road. I know it may not happen even in our lifetime, but the signs are there amongst the young and the next generation that this may be something that we are headed towards. Number one, anticipate the trend. Number two, focus on the essentials for the exercise of our liberty. Let's take a leaf from the wedding vendor cases. And here I need your participation. Is that all right? Can we get a little more engaging? Let me ask you, if you are a Christian baker, will you bake a cake for a same-sex couple who wants to get married? Audience participation. I won't judge you on that. Only I'm recording on camera. Your responses are not. How many of you would bake a cake for a same-sex couple who wants to get married? It's okay. You can raise your hands. I see some hands. It's okay. Eugene has raised his... Sorry for naming you. Can I just... One, two, three. Raise your hands. Good, because we see some. Some of you have said no issue with baking a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. And guess what? In the case of Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado civil rights case, this is a US case, right? The Christian baker didn't want to bake. And it was rude that it was discriminatory not to do so. Okay? Let's get a bit more interesting now. If you are a Christian baker, will you bake a cake with the slogan, support gay marriage? Anyone? Just raise your hands if you think it's okay. Clearly no. Because that's your conviction. You really do not support gay marriage. And then it's an actual case. In Lee versus MacArthur, that's a Northern Ireland case. So I've used different jurisdictions, right? US, Northern Ireland. Now, the Court of Appeal ruled that it would be discrimination to refuse to do so. Right? So what happened? Lee came to the MacArthur, who was a baker, and said, I want you to bake a cake, and on it write support gay marriage. And so MacArthur said, absolutely no, I'm not going to do that. Right? And so he was ruled as discriminatory. Guess what? He went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court reversed the decision. Interesting. It ruled that anyone can support or not support gay marriage, and not supporting gay marriage does not mean discriminating against one's sexual orientation. You see the point? You see the difference? You may not be gay yourself. You just don't support gay marriage. And not supporting gay marriage doesn't mean that you're discriminating against someone's sexual orientation. Which means that MacArthur did nothing wrong. It's his own conviction that he will not support gay marriage. Whether Lee himself was gay or not, that was not discrimination against Lee directly. It's just a personal conviction. So that's how the Supreme Court came to this contrary position. Now, if you go and look at the wedding vendor cases, there are many out there. And so you can tell it's not easy for the courts at all to make the decisions. But what's my point? What's the lesson from this? With one more illustration. If you are a Christian hotel keeper, will you let a double room out to a same-sex couple? Anyone? I see people shaking their heads. Come, raise your hands if you feel comfortable letting a room out to a same-sex couple. Okay, I see some hands being raised. Guess what? If you don't do that, the UK, now I've gone to the United Kingdom, right? The UK courts ruled that it was discriminatory in not doing so. What's my point? Any lesson do we glean from this? And as I went through all these different cases in my research, I think there is one thing we need to distinguish. Do we deny a service to an individual because of their sexual identity or orientation? Or do we stay faithful to a conviction that allows us to say no? I think there's a distinction between offering a service and standing by your religious conviction. So where do we draw the line? The point I'm trying to make is this, my friends. I think with the trend that's going to come, I think we need to identify for us as the church what will be the essence and the core of our faith and our beliefs. What would then be the fundamental and non-negotiable stance and practices of our religious liberty? I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think it's going to be absolutely necessary. What's going to be the bottom line? And again, from a show of hands here, it's not easy to find a consensus. But I think as the church, we may need to provide some form and space for dialogue and conversation and talk about what are the fundamental non-negotiables. Yes, our religious liberty may be under assault. It may be in conflict with civil liberties. What would we retreat to a point where we say, this is the absolute no, we will stand with this? Will we stand and say, we will not support gay marriage, but yes, we will provide a service, possibly, even to a same-sex couple, because, as my next point will illustrate, there is a place for compassionate accommodation. What would then be our fundamental stand? Let me give you an example. This is going to be a real example, and I think I'm ready for that. Pastors, I'm a state solemnizer now, which means I solemnize state weddings. I have the right to make, in a sense, a marriage legal, having gone through. I have a solemnization license. But there may come a time with same-sex marriage being legalized where I would say I will not solemnize such marriages. But I will stand by my right to bless a Christian marriage. For me, that will be a non-negotiable. For me, this will be the place where I feel that I will not let go of my practice of my faith to bless a Christian marriage according to the principles of the Word of God. That's one example. And I think that will be a fundamental call. So again, you may agree or disagree, but I think we all need to think about it. And as pastors, as persons of faith, as all of us as Christian community, we need to think about that. What would be fundamental for us? For example, perhaps would be the right to preach and propagate our beliefs. Of course, how we do it is important. Don't confuse the message with the method. I think the law can and should regulate the method. We should do it with kindness. We should not be derogatory. We should not be prejudicial. We should not be outright slamming other religions. I think that's fair. But I think we should keep to a fundamental call and right to preach, for example, the Christian message. And so hear me, my friends. That's the second thing I want to share with you. I think it's not easy, but I think we need to identify what then is fundamental and core to us. And the third thought I want to leave with you is that, move on to that. We need to exercise compassionate accommodation where necessary. In things non-essential, let there be charity. We know this very well-known saying. Now, while we may have liberty, but I think we are bound by the responsibility of love. While we may have liberty, we are first and foremost bound by the responsibility of love. And Eugene has mentioned that in loving the neighbor. So compassionate accommodation is a place where we say, yes, the liberties conflict, civil and religious, but how much and how far will we go to accommodate with compassion? And so on the issue of gender and sexuality, if I may suggest, for me, it is non-criminalization right at the top. And that's why many of us agree that Section 3778 should go, because at the core of it, it criminalizes sexual activity. And that, we feel, it's not fair. And right down, if you go down the next level, we non-marginalization, non-discrimination. And then we talk about dignity and respect of the individual. Then we talk about justice and equality for all, which is one of the core values of our nation. And so I think these will guide me in what I call a compassionate accommodation. Now, the specifics and details may not be easy to work out. But here's where I ask myself, will baking a wedding cake for a same-sex couple, would that fall into a framework of a compassionate accommodation? Will I deny them the service of a wedding cake, for example, just because of my religious beliefs? Not easy to answer, right? How far would I go with that? But I think that's something we need to carefully and intentionally think and pray about. Do same-sex couples have a right to adopt children? A right to own housing? Do you know housing is really expensive today? Yeah, we all know that. I came across this article by Rise Media that features Sean Tan. Who is Sean Tan? Sean Tan is a property agent for same-sex couples. Very interesting. I never knew that existed. Sean's LinkedIn biography, he reads, I specialize in LGBTQ housing in Singapore. My job is to help queer couples and individuals optimize and strategically structure their property portfolio with structural constraints. This really blew my mind. I mean, I want my own children, I want my son to have housing and affordable housing. But I imagine something gave Sean this passion to help queer couples, same-sex couples, enjoy that right and perhaps that service of housing as well, because they are individuals, they are also human beings. How will we view that? What's our stand on that? Not easy, right? When I look at your faces, you don't know what to do. I don't profess to have an answer. But would you refer a same-sex couple to Sean? Because they really are looking for housing? Would you do that? I don't have the answer myself. I think when it comes face to face with that, I would struggle. But what then is loving the neighbor? What then is the compassionate accommodation at some point in time that we need to show? So that's my third thought. And with that, I come to my final one and I'll close. The final one is this. I think we are called as a church to respond to that calling and task that God has given us. I'm reminded of our responsibility for social engagement. And I'm guided by what Dr. Daniel Cole wrote in an article for ETHOS some time ago. And he gave 3 guidelines. Faithfulness, which means integrity to the Word of God. He talked about fairness, which means justice to all. He talked about feasibility, which means it's practicable. These 3 F's have helped me to frame my own thinking about social engagement. Is it fair? Is it faithful to God's Word? Is it feasible? And I think that first and foremost, as the church, we need to be able to articulate our faith and beliefs clearly, coherently, and courageously. I think there's a place where as the church we must come together, and I thank God for ETHOS, for a think tank that will help to articulate some of these very, very controversial, very difficult thoughts and give practical suggestions on us as the church to be able to reach out and engage. But excellence, clarity, because this next generation ain't going to take a simplistic answer or simple answer. They're going to ask for more. And we must be able to rise and explain and take a position of charity, of kindness, and yet a position that will articulate clearly what we believe in. Number 2, we need to engage in timely and winsome dialogue with authorities. Timely and winsome. Timely means we could anticipate what's around the curve, which means we cannot wait for it to happen and then respond, which means that we got to be actively asking what's round the bend and what can we do then. We got to know, our fillers got to be out and know what the government intends to do and know the ground that we may engage in dialogue with government. And I think that as the church, we need to believe that we have something to bring to the table. You see, in my view, Christian beliefs are not just some religious truths applicable to Christians. I think we can offer the perspective that God's design and pattern for human sexuality and even other issues form a blueprint and guide for human flourishing. And I think there's a place for that where we bring that to the table to help government authorities formulate policies and even legislation. That's something that I think it's incumbent on us to be able to articulate clearly and to bring across courageously. And my last point as I close is this. We need to witness to the world that our security is not in the guarantee of rights or liberty, but in the providence of God through our faithful obedience. You see, as Singaporeans, we are very right-centered and very rights-based. I have a right. I have the right to Wi-Fi all the time. I have a right to aircon that works. I have also a right to have it anytime I want. So we are very rights-based because we live in a very comfortable. But you know, religious liberties, even though guaranteed by the Constitution, is a gift from God. And as I prepare for this, I'm humbled that God has given us the religious freedom we have in this land. Let us not take it for granted. Let our security not be in the law of man, which guarantees somehow our rights, but rather let our security be in the gift and the grace and the providence of God. Because, hey, my friends, one day when those religious liberties are taken away from us, then we will look to God and we say, God, give us your grace and strength. That as Apostle Paul said, we will choose to obey you rather than obey men. I say this with much fear and trembling, because it truly isn't easy to go that way. But let that be our witness to the world, that our security does not lie in the legal framework, but in God's design and providence. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you.